There's a kind of silence that doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, slowly, gently, like the early morning fog that wraps around the porch without asking. That was the kind of quiet Evelyn felt one Sunday morning. She sat by the window, her cup of tea untouched, cooling in her hands. Her phone lay face up on the table, lit for a moment with the familiar name, Margaret. She didn't press call. She just stared, as if the name itself could bring back the laughter, the comfort, the warm hum of conversation that used to come so easily. But something held her back. And it wasn't just pride, it was something deeper, a strange flutter in her chest, a question she didn't have words for yet. Have you ever felt that? A craving not just to talk, but to be heard fully, completely, without needing to explain yourself? A yearning not just for company, but for someone who could sit beside you and know that silence too has a language? Evelyn wasn't lonely, not exactly. She had friends. She had time. But lately she'd begun to wonder, was she visiting people to reconnect? Or was she running from something inside her that had grown too quiet, too loud, too real? And here's the part no one warns you about. Sometimes when you reach for a friend during a moment of emptiness, you're not really reaching for them. You're reaching away from yourself. In the story I'm about to share with you, we'll walk with Evelyn, and maybe in some quiet way, with parts of ourselves too, as she learns that the cure for loneliness isn't always found in another person's voice. Sometimes it's found in the courage to sit with your own. So if you've ever picked up the phone, then hesitated, if you've ever smiled through coffee with an old friend and gone home feeling strangely hollow, stay with me. There's something here, something soft but true, waiting to be uncovered. The wait behind the knock that afternoon, Evelyn finally put on her coat. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that made even the birds sound distant. She stepped outside, clutching a small container of shortbread cookies, Margaret's favorite, and walked the familiar path toward her friend's house. Each step echoed something she didn't want to name: need. But here's the paradox that no one teaches you about aging. The more time you have, the less certain you become of how to spend it. And loneliness, that master of disguise, often shows up not as sadness, but as urgency. A sudden urge to do something, see someone, be anywhere but here, inside yourself. Evelyn knocked twice, no answer. She tried again, 3, maybe 4 times, before realizing the lights were off. The car was gone. Margaret wasn't home. But something far more unsettling happened then. It wasn't just disappointment she felt. It was panic, an irrational, rising sense that if Margaret wasn't there, no one else would be either. Not today, not tomorrow, not when she needed them most. And that's when the memory hit her, sharp and uninvited. A page she'd read in a book long ago by neuroscientist Dr. John Cacioppo, the father of modern loneliness research. He wrote that chronic loneliness activates the same brain regions as physical pain, specifically the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. In other words, the brain registers social disconnection the same way it registers a burn. Evelyn didn't know those brain parts by name, but she felt them. It was a quiet ache behind her ribs, a clenching in her jaw, a heat rising behind her eyes. Not because her friend wasn't home, but because she didn't know how to be home within herself. She stood there on the porch, clutching the cookies like an offering to a god that never showed up. Was this what it had come to? Not friendship, not connection, but emotional desperation dressed in shortbread and small talk? She thought of a quote she once underlined in a tattered journal. Sometimes we do not seek people, we seek anesthesia. And in that moment, something cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but like a thin sheet of ice finally giving way under slow, patient pressure. She turned around slowly, deliberately. The walk home felt heavier but clearer. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about Margaret at all. Maybe this was the first time Evelyn had caught herself mid-pattern, mid-reflex, mid-flight, and chosen to return not to someone else's door, but to her own. The ache that echoes. By the time Evelyn reached her front door, the sky had darkened, not just above her, but within her. She set the untouched cookies on the kitchen table, watched as the condensation from the container slowly fogged the plastic. It was a small, quiet symbol of something deeper, a warmth sealed away, a sweetness never shared. She didn't cry, not yet. Instead, she moved through her home like a guest. Rooms she'd walked through thousands of times now felt oddly foreign. The hallway, the armchair by the bookshelf, the soft ticking of the wall clock that had once marked the rhythm of a busy life, now ticking only for itself. And somewhere between the second and third tick, a thought began to surface. What if I've been building my life around borrowed energy? What if, without realizing it, I've made others responsible for emotions they never agreed to hold? It was a terrifying idea, not because it made her feel ashamed, but because it felt true. And truth, when it finally arrives, never shouts. It whispers, calmly, clearly, and without apology. In that silence, Evelyn remembered a story she once read about Florence Nightingale. Not just the lady with the lamp, but the woman who, after transforming battlefield medicine, spent her later years in seclusion, wrestling with profound spiritual and psychological loneliness. Despite being surrounded by letters, accolades, and admirers, she confessed in her diaries that she often felt more isolated in a room full of people than she ever did alone. Her lesson was simple. Proximity isn't connection. Noise isn't intimacy. And neither is a visit when it's used to outrun the stillness inside. Evelyn pressed her palm against her chest, as if trying to steady a truth that felt too big for one heart to hold. It wasn't just Margaret she had been running to. It was the illusion of being understood, the illusion that someone else's presence could sew together all the places that had quietly unraveled in the wake of retirement. But science had long revealed what most of us fear to believe. Emotional overdependence corrodes connection from the inside. It creates invisible contracts in relationships, unspoken expectations, silent demands, until one day the weight of need outweighs the joy of presence. She thought of the last time she saw Margaret, not the smile, but the slight pause before the hug, the way her friend's eyes scanned the clock, the way conversation felt more like obligation than ease. And for the first time, Evelyn didn't feel angry. She felt responsible. How many moments had she shown up not to give, but to take? Not in malice, but in emotional hunger. Not in selfishness, but in unawareness. And that was the warning now echoing through her bones. If you do not learn to befriend your solitude, it will teach you by taking away every false refuge you've leaned on. One by one, gently, painfully, with the wisdom of a teacher who loves you enough to let you fall. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the windows like a breath on cold glass. And in that sound, Evelyn heard not the world calling her outward, but something within, calling her home, the quiet rebellion. That evening, Evelyn didn't call anyone. No apologetic texts, no masked pleasantries. The cookies remained untouched on the table, and the silence in the house felt fuller than it had in weeks. Not empty, not threatening, but alert. As though the very air was listening in. She made herself a simple dinner, roasted carrots, soft rice, a boiled egg. She plated it with care, as if she were expecting company, and then, slowly, she sat at the table. Alone. Present. It was the first meal in months she hadn't eaten in front of the television. And as her fork moved through the food, something subtle began to shift. There was no music playing, No conversation to distract, no performance to keep up. Just her breath, her senses, her own quiet company. It felt both foreign and familiar, like finding an old photograph of yourself and not quite recognizing the eyes. As the hours passed, Evelyn surprised herself. She didn't reach for her phone. Instead, she opened an old notebook. The pages were yellowing, the spine cracked with time, but her handwriting, still elegant, still deliberate, greeted her like an old friend who remembered the parts of her that life had long since asked her to set aside. She began to write, not for anyone to read, not for any great revelation, but because her thoughts for once felt worthy of being held. I have built too many bridges out of fear of drowning in myself. Tonight I sat still on the shore, and the tide didn't take me, it cradled me. She paused, her pen hovering. For the first time, her loneliness didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a compass, pointing inward. She recalled the words of Carl Jung, scrawled once on a postcard her son had sent from university. He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens. Was this what awakening felt like? Not a burst of light, but the slow widening of the soul's eyes. Not a breakthrough, but a soft, consistent turning back toward herself. That night, as Evelyn prepared for bed, she did something she hadn't done since her husband passed. She opened the bedroom window just a crack, let the cool air in, let the sound of the night settle around her, not as something to be feared, but as evidence that the world could hold her, even when no one else was near. She lay down beneath the weight of her blanket, but for once the heaviness wasn't in her chest. It was the comforting weight of returning to her body, to her breath, to the quiet truth that she was and had always been enough. The space between souls days passed, not in a blur, not in that strange haze of habitual movement that used to carry Evelyn from task to task, but in full color, each moment arriving and leaving like a breath she could finally feel. She still had her quiet, but now it didn't feel like a lack. It felt like room to think, to stretch, to notice. She began walking again, early while the sun was still deciding whether to rise. The streets were nearly empty, save for the sleepy rustle of leaves and the occasional glint of dew on mailbox tops. It was during these walks that Evelyn first realized something astonishing. She had stopped checking her phone, not because she was trying to prove something, but because the stillness had started to feed her in ways conversation never quite could. And then, one Wednesday afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was Margaret. Her coat was half buttoned, her cheeks pink with wind, and in her hands, oddly, was Evelyn's Tupperware container. "I found this on my porch," Margaret said with a soft laugh. "You must have stopped by the other day. I was at my daughter's." There was a pause, long enough for Evelyn to remember how their conversations used to go. Quick, warm, layered with assumptions and smiles that sometimes felt too tight. But something inside her had changed. She didn't leap to explain. She didn't fill the silence. Instead, she smiled, gently, fully, and stepped aside. Would you like to come in? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Just for a bit. They sat in the living room, no TV, no music, just the clink of spoons stirring tea. And as they settled into their chairs, something extraordinary happened. They didn't talk about errands, or the neighbors, or the price of eggs. Instead, Margaret exhaled deeply and said, I've been tired lately. Not the kind that sleep fixes, just tired of pretending everything's fine. And Evelyn, instead of rushing in to soothe or distract or make it all better, simply said, Me too. Those two words opened a window, and for the first time in years, the two women spoke, not just to pass time, but to reveal time. They talked about the ache of transition, about what it meant to not be needed in the same way anymore, about the strange grief that hides in freedom. And what bloomed in that room was not a return to the old friendship, but the birth of a truer one, rooted not in habit, but in presence, not in dependence, but in recognition. Evelyn realized then what solitude had been teaching her all along. Connection isn't about being rescued from loneliness. It's about meeting another soul as whole as your own. And that could only happen once she had learned to sit, unafraid, in the empty spaces of herself. Outside, the late afternoon sun spilled golden across the windowsill. The air in the room was still, but not silent. It carried something sacred. The space between two women who had finally, fully learned to listen. The last cup of tea. As the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting amber streaks across Evelyn's living room floor, something inside her settled. Not because she had found all the answers. She hadn't. Not because the ache had vanished. Some aches stay, not to wound, but to remind. But because, for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the silence that followed after the voices left. Margaret had gone home. The teacups were still warm, and Evelyn sat there. Not lonely, but alone, in the truest, most courageous sense of the word. She looked out the window toward the horizon she used to ignore. The world was still wide, still waiting, but she no longer needed to chase it in search of someone to complete her, because something had shifted. She was no longer knocking on doors, hoping someone would make her feel whole. She was becoming the door, the home, the presence she used to search for in others. And now, dear listener, what about you? How many of your footsteps, your phone calls, your cheerful visits have been quiet cries in disguise? How many of your friendships are built on shared light? And how many on shared fear of the dark? This isn't a question meant to shame. It's a question meant to free. Because perhaps, just perhaps, the loneliness you fear is not your enemy. Perhaps it's the echo of a self you've forgotten to sit beside. And if you dare, just once, to greet that echo, not with panic, but with patience, you might find a companion more faithful than any friend, yourself. So tonight, let the house be quiet. Let the phone stay still. Let your own breath be the voice you finally learn to listen to. And remember this, the most sacred kind of connection begins where pretending ends. Now close your eyes, not to escape the world, but to return to it from somewhere more whole. Thank you for walking this story with me. Until next time, may your silence be gentle and your company true. So here we are. 5 stories, 5 truths, 5 quiet invitations to pause, to notice, to reimagine what movement really means as we age. We've walked through dizziness and aching joints, through healing scars and feet that no longer speak, through breathlessness that whispers of deeper things below the surface. And now I leave you with this. What if fewer steps didn't mean less life, but more of it? What if slowing down wasn't the beginning of the end, but the beginning of a deeper kind of attention? One that listens, not just to how far we walk, but to what our bodies are saying with every breath, every beat, every quiet ache. Because maybe the bravest thing isn't to keep walking no matter what. Maybe the bravest thing is to stop, to feel, to say, this no longer serves me, and choose a new way forward. You see, aging isn't a defeat, it's a refinement. The same way a river smooths a stone, our years have softened us. And in that softness lives a strength no youth can ever touch. So if something you heard today stirred something in you, a memory, a question, maybe even a flicker of fear, don't run from it. Sit with it. Let it breathe. Then ask your body, what do you need from me now? Maybe the answer is fewer steps. Maybe it's different shoes. Maybe it's the courage to ask for help. Or maybe it's simply the permission to walk a little slower and notice more than you ever did before. This isn't the end of your movement story. It's the moment where the story deepens, where wisdom takes the lead, and every step becomes a choice, not a habit. Thank you for walking with me through this journey. Now go walk with yourself, gently, wisely, and with eyes wide open. Until next time. So now the room is still again. The story has been told. And maybe, just maybe, something in you has shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, but like the slow turning of a tide. Quiet, certain, and impossible to ignore. Maybe you've begun to wonder if the loneliness you feared was really just a longing to be alone with yourself. Maybe you've started to see that peace isn't something you find in the noise, but in the space between all the things you no longer need to chase. And now as we reach the end, I want to leave you not with an answer, but with a question that doesn't shout, but waits patiently in the silence that follows. What if the life you've been waiting for has been waiting for you, right here in the quiet all along? Let it sit with you. Let it walk beside you in the evening. Let it echo in the room when no one else is home. Because here's the truth. Living alone after 65 isn't the end of a connection. It's the beginning of the most honest one you'll ever have. The one with yourself. So go ahead. Pour that cup of tea, open the window, put on the music no one else understands but you. And when the world outside grows loud again, because it always will, remember this moment. Remember that there is a place within you where the noise stops and the knowing begins. Thank you for being here. Take this stillness with you. Let it change you. Let it free you. And most of all, let it bring you home.